I'm Diane, 29, female. I live in a quiet suburban town in a two-bedroom apartment that I meticulously decorated myself. For the past 5 years, my life has been dedicated to my career as a quality control inspector for a major aerospace manufacturer and to my relationship with my fiancé, Mark. I thought we were building a future, but I was about to discover that the product I needed to inspect most closely was my own life, and it was failing on every level. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Life with Mark felt like a perfectly assembled product, at least on the surface. He was a financial analyst, a world of sharp suits, high-stakes accounts, and a vocabulary I only half understood. Our lives were a study in contrasts. He thrived in the abstract world of numbers and projections, while I lived in the tangible world of millimeters, stress tolerances, and material integrity. My job was to find flaws others missed, to ensure that a tiny, overlooked crack in a turbine blade didn't become a catastrophe at 30,000 feet. I was proud of what I did. It was precise, essential, and honest work. Mark, however, saw it differently. To him, my job was a curiosity, a blue-collar oddity he couldn't quite fit into the pristine narrative he was crafting for our life together. "It's so, hands-on," he'd say, a phrase that sounded like a compliment but felt like a thinly veiled insult. He loved the idea of me, the stable, grounded woman who managed our home with the same efficiency she managed her inspection reports. But the details of my professional life, those he preferred to keep blurred and out of focus. Our apartment was his showpiece. Every piece of minimalist furniture was chosen by him. Every piece of abstract art hung according to his precise vision. It was beautiful, sterile, and felt more like a hotel lobby than a home. My own touches were relegated to the second bedroom, which I used as a home office and reading nook. It was the only room that felt like it belonged to me, filled with my technical manuals my war, not fantasy novels, and a comfortable, slightly lumpy armchair he despised. The proposal had been just as curated. It happened at a rooftop restaurant with a guest list that felt more like a networking event. He got down on one knee, presented a flawless diamond, and the applause from his colleagues and clients was deafening. I said yes, caught up in the spectacle. I loved him, or at least, I loved the man I thought he was, the charming, ambitious partner who held my hand and promised me the world. But looking back, I realize he wasn't promising me the world. He was promising me his world, and I was just an accessory meant to complete the picture. His friends were all cut from the same cloth. Lawyers, consultants, and tech entrepreneurs who talked about IPO and stock options the way I talked about tensile strength and ultrasonic testing. I often felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. I would smile, nod, and try to contribute, but my anecdotes about factory floor audits and supplier certifications were usually met with polite, blank stares. One of his closest friends was Chloe, a corporate lawyer who was as sharp and polished as a shard of glass. She had a way of looking at me, a subtle up and down glance that made me feel like I was a faulty component she was about to flag for rejection. Mark adored her. He praised her intellect, her killer instinct in the courtroom, and the way she could command a room. "You two should get to know each other better," he'd often say, completely oblivious to the cold condescension that radiated from her. The disconnect grew slowly, a hairline fracture I chose to ignore. I'd tell myself that our differences were our strength. He was the dreamer, I was the realist. He built castles in the sky, and I made sure the foundations were solid. It was a romantic notion, but it was a lie. The truth was, he was embarrassed by my foundations. He wanted the castle, but he didn't want anyone to know it was held up by someone who wore stilt, owed boots to work. This realization hadn't fully formed in my mind yet. It was just a background hum of anxiety, a system warning I kept silencing. The final diagnostic test was coming, and it would reveal a system failure more critical than I could have ever imagined. The venue for this test would be his colleague's promotion party, a gathering of the very people I felt most invisible around. And it was there that Mark, my fiancé, would hand me the inspection report on our relationship, and I would finally see the fatal flaw. The party was held in a sprawling penthouse apartment that overlooked the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering lights, and the air buzzed with champagne, fueled conversations about market trends and vacation homes in the Hamptons. It was Mark's natural habitat. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, his hand possessively on the small of my back, guiding me from one cluster of expensive suits to another. I felt like a prop, my smile starting to feel as rigid as the safety helmet I wore at work. For the first hour, it was the usual routine. Mark would introduce me, "This is my fiancé, Diane," and the conversation would flow around me but never to me. I'd listen to talk of mergers and acquisitions, offering a noncommittal that's fascinating, when a pause seemed to call for it. I was doing my part, playing the role of the supportive, quiet partner. Then, Mark spotted Chloe holding court near the balcony. She was laughing, a throaty, confident sound, dressed in a red dress so sharp it could have been a weapon. A small group of people, clearly captivated, hung on her every word. "Come on," Mark said, his grip on my back tightening. "I want you to meet some key people from my firm." As we approached, Chloe's eyes met mine over the rim of her champagne flute. There was a flicker of something, amusement, maybe pity, before her expression settled into a welcoming smile that didn't reach her eyes. The group included a senior partner Mark was desperate to impress and his wife. This was it, a primetime performance for my fiancé. "Everyone," Mark announced, his voice booming with false cheerfulness, "I'd like you to meet my wonderful fiancé, Diane." The senior partner and his wife smiled warmly at me. I extended my hand, ready to deliver my practiced, polite introduction. But Mark kept talking, and his next words landed like a physical blow. "She's got a very interesting job," he began, and I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. He was using a tone I knew all too well, the one he used when he was about to tell a joke at someone else's expense. "She's a quality control inspector." He paused for effect, letting the title hang in the air, stripped of its importance and context. The smiles on the faces of the partner and his wife faltered, replaced by looks of polite confusion. Then came the punchline, delivered with a condescending chuckle, "Basically." Mark elaborated, gesturing vaguely with his free hand. "She works in a factory and, checks if things are screwed on tight." The laughter was immediate. It wasn't cruel, not from the partner and his wife. It was the awkward, confused laughter of people who don't understand a joke but feel obligated to react. But Chloe's laugh was different. It was genuine, sharp, and laced with mockery. She looked from Mark to me, a triumphant glint in her eyes. In that moment, they were a team, and I was the punchline. He had reduced my career, the work that I was deeply proud of, the work that prevented disasters and saved lives, to a cartoonish caricature. "Screwed on tight." The words echoed in my head, drowning out the party noise. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Mark, hoping to see a hint of regret, a sign that he'd realized he'd gone too far. Instead, he just smiled at me, a smug, self-satisfied smile that said, "See, I'm charming. I can even make your boring job sound funny." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, frozen, my carefully constructed composure shattering like flawed glass under pressure. I mumbled something about needing to find the restroom and extricated myself from the group, ignoring Mark's confused, "Where are you going, hon?" In the cold, marble-clad guest bathroom, I stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. Her eyes were wide with a pain and humiliation so profound it felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. He hadn't just insulted my job, he had insulted me. He had held up the core of my identity to a room full of people he valued and presented it as a joke. He had broadcast to the world, to his world, that I wasn't his equal. I was a novelty, a quaint little project he was undertaking. The gilded cage I had been living in suddenly felt claustrophobic, and the bars were his condescension and my willing ignorance. The worst part was the chilling realization that this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated statement, and as I stood there, the noise of the party a distant roar, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't just a joke, it was a betrayal. The car ride home was a symphony of suffocating silence. Mark tried to fill it, of course. He talked about how well the party had gone, how much the senior partner seemed to like him, how Chloe had been on fire tonight. He was completely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the chasm that had opened up between us on that penthouse balcony. I offered one. Word answers, my gaze fixed on the blur of streetlights passing by the passenger window. Each light felt like a flash of clarity, illuminating the ugly truth of my situation. "You were quiet tonight," he finally observed as we pulled into our parking garage. "Everything okay. I'm just tired. I lied. The energy it would take to explain why I was hurt felt monumental, and I knew instinctively that he would just dismiss it. He'd call me too sensitive, or tell me I can't take a joke." His playbook was predictable, and I was suddenly too exhausted to participate in the game. Back in the apartment, the sterile perfection felt mocking. Mark, still buzzing from his social triumph, poured himself a glass of whiskey and started recounting a hilarious story Chloe had told. I excused myself, claiming a headache, and retreated to the bedroom. I changed out of my party dress, the fabric feeling like a costume from a life that was no longer mine, and curled up in bed. I listened to him moving around the living room, the clink of his glass, the low murmur of the TV. Sleep was impossible. My mind was a loop of his words, his condescending tone, and Chloe's triumphant laughter. It must have been after 2 a.m. when he finally came to bed. He was clumsy with drink, stumbling slightly as he got undressed and dropping his phone on the nightstand with a clatter. Within minutes, he was fast asleep, breathing the deep, untroubled breaths of a man with no conscience, but I was wide awake. The hurt had begun to curdle into something else, suspicion. The easy camaraderie between him and Chloe, the way he had sought her approval with that joke. It wasn't just friendship. It felt like an alliance against me. His phone lay on the nightstand, and its dark screen a blank slate of secrets. I had never looked through his phone before. I'd always believed that trust was the bedrock of a relationship, a non-negotiable standard. But hadn't he shattered that trust tonight? What is privacy worth in the face of such profound disrespect? My heart hammered against my ribs. My internal inspector, the one that tells me to check every component, to never assume, was screaming at me. I slipped out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate. The floor was cold under my feet. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the power button. This was the point of no return. If I looked, I could never go back to the comfortable illusion I had been living in. If I found nothing, I would be the paranoid, insecure fiancé he probably thought I was. But if I found something, I pressed the button. The screen lit up, no password. He always used facial recognition, but in his drunken state, he must have turned the phone off and on, which required the passcode he rarely used. Or perhaps in his arrogance, he simply didn't think he had anything to hide from me. The home screen appeared, a grid of apps that mapped out his life. My hands were trembling as I tapped the green icon for his messages. My eyes scanned the list of recent conversations. My own name was near the top, a series of mundane texts about groceries and dinner plans. Then I saw hers, Chloe. The last message was from just an hour ago. My breath hitched. I opened the thread. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating years of casual lies and one enormous lie, faltering truth. Chloe, the screwed-on tight line was savage. You're terrible. Mark, had to be done. She needs to understand her place. The partner loved it. Chloe, did she say anything on the way home? Mark, nah. Pouting, probably. She'll get over it. She always does. I scrolled up, my stomach twisting into a knot. The messages went back months, years. They weren't just flirty. They were a running commentary on his life with me. He complained about me, mocked my job, my friends, my taste in movies. He shared intimate details I had only ever told him. And Chloe was his gleeful audience, encouraging him, laughing with him, and validating his contempt for me. Then I found it, the messages from last summer when he was on a business trip to Chicago. Chloe, I can't believe this hotel. You weren't kidding about the view. Mark, the view is better with you in it. Wish this trip didn't have to end. Chloe, well, you have to go home to your little inspector eventually. Don't forget to bring her back some cheap souvenir. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the plush rug. It was all there, a full-blown affair, not just physical but emotional. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was actively conspiring with another woman to belittle and undermine me. The party wasn't a mistake. It was a symptom of a disease that had been rotting our relationship from the inside out for years. The man sleeping peacefully in my bed was a stranger, and the woman he was betraying was a fool. But as I stood there in the darkness, the fool began to disappear, replaced by the inspector. The inspection had begun. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, a hollow ache in my chest where my heart used to be. The digital clock read 5:15 a.m. Beside me, Mark was still sound asleep, oblivious. I looked at his face, the features once so beloved, and felt nothing but a cold, sterile detachment, like a scientist observing a specimen. The grief would come later, I knew. Right now, my mind was in a state of hyper-clarity. My internal protocols had been activated. The initial finding was a critical failure. Now came the investigation phase, root cause analysis. I slipped out of bed and went to my home office, the one room in the apartment that was truly mine. I closed the door, sat in my lumpy armchair, and opened my laptop. For years, my job had trained me to be methodical, to gather data, to trust evidence over emotion, and to document everything. I was about to apply my professional skills to the wreckage of my personal life. I started a new document, password, protected, entitled Project Recalibration. My first call to action was to my best friend, Sarah. I texted her, code red, "Can you talk?" A minute later, my phone buzzed. "What's wrong?" Her voice was thick with sleep but instantly alert. In quiet, measured tones, I told her everything: the party, the screwed-on tight comment, the unlocked phone, the messages. I recounted the details with the same dispassionate precision I used when briefing an engineering team on a component flaw. Sarah listened without interrupting, the silence on her end a comforting blanket. When I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She just said, "Okay, so what's the plan, Inspector?" Hearing her use my job title that way, not as a punchline, but as a sign of respect for my capabilities, nearly broke the dam of my composure. "The plan is to gather more data," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to understand the full scope of the failure before I decide on the corrective action." "I'm here for whatever you need," she said. Reconnaissance, alibi, a shoulder to cry on, just say the word. Hanging up, I felt a surge of strength. I wasn't alone. With Sarah as my ally, the task ahead felt less daunting. I spent the next hour mapping out my investigation. The text messages were my preliminary report. Now I needed to find the supporting evidence. I started with our finances. Mark handled most of our joint accounts, priding himself on his portfolio management. I'd always just let him, trusting his expertise. Now I logged into our shared credit card account. I filtered the statements, looking for the dates of his business trips. Over the past 2 years, there it was, clear as day, the Chicago trip from last summer. His company had paid for his flight and hotel, but there was another charge, a dinner for two at a ridiculously expensive restaurant, a charge for a couple's spa package, tickets to a theater show, things a man on a solo business trip wouldn't be buying. I cross-referenced the dates with Chloe's social media. Her Instagram was private, but Mark followed her, using his still, unlocked phone. I navigated to her page. Her feed was a curated highlight reel of a perfect life. And there it was, a picture from last summer, posted on the exact date of that expensive dinner. She was holding a cocktail, the city lights of Chicago sparkling behind her. The caption read, "Windy City Nights with the Best Company." There was no one else in the picture, but the table she was sitting at was clearly set for two. I kept digging. A business trip to San Diego in the spring. A weekend leadership conference in Miami last fall. Each trip corresponded with a flurry of suspicious credit card charges, and, if I looked closely, a subtle hint on Chloe's social media. A picture of a beach with 2 sets of footprints. A photo of 2 wine glasses with a vague, celebratory caption. The dots connected into a damning mosaic of deceit. It wasn't just a single affair. It was an entire secret life he had been living, funded by our shared finances. He had been laughing at me with her, spending our future on her, all while I was at home, working overtime shifts to help us save for the wedding he was probably complaining to her about. The disrespect from the party wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was the system working as designed. He genuinely believed I was beneath him, a placeholder, a convenience. The mockery was the truth bubbling to the surface. I sat back, the document on my screen now filled with dates, screenshots, and financial records. It was a comprehensive failure analysis report. The root cause was not a simple affair. It was a fundamental flaw in the character of the man I had promised to marry. He was defective, and as a quality control inspector, I knew what had to be done with defective parts. They weren't to be repaired or reworked. They were to be scrapped, but not before I made sure the reason for the rejection was clearly and publicly documented. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a double life. To Mark, I was the dutiful fiancé who had, just as he predicted, gotten over it. I apologized for being moody after the party, blaming it on stress at work. He bought it instantly, patting my arm with a smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "I told you it was just a joke, babe," he said, his absolution swift and condescending. His arrogance was my greatest asset. He saw my compliance as weakness, never suspecting it was the calm surface of a meticulously laid trap. Internally, I was no longer Diane, the fiancé. I was Inspector D, running the most important quality check of my life. My project recalibration document grew daily. I compiled every piece of evidence, screenshots of texts, highlighted credit card statements showing lavish spending on his solo trips, and social media posts from Chloe that, when placed on a timeline next to Mark's travel, told an undeniable story. I was building a case, piece by piece, with the dispassionate patience of my profession. My conversations with Sarah were my lifeline. She was my sounding board, my strategist, and my moral support. "So, are you just going to pack a bag and leave a note?" she asked one evening as we sat in her cozy living room, a world away from the sterile chill of my apartment. "That would be a quiet, dignified exit," I replied, swirling the tea in my mug. Mark doesn't deserve dignified. He built his entire identity around his image, his reputation. A quiet exit would let him control the narrative. He'd tell everyone I was unstable, that I left him for no reason. No, the corrective action needs to be proportional to the defect. "So, what's the plan?" she asked, leaning forward. "How do you scrap a defective fiancé? You perform a public product recall." I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "You expose the flaw at the point of maximum impact." The opportunity presented itself a few days later. Mark came home beaming, waving 2 embossed invitations. "Guess what?" he announced. "My parents are throwing us an official engagement dinner at the Sterling Club. They've invited everyone, my boss, the senior partners, a few big clients. It's going to be perfect." The Sterling Club was an old, money-exclusive private club where reputation was currency. It was the ultimate stage. His entire world, his family, his career, his social standing, would be gathered in one room to celebrate us. To celebrate the lie. It was, as he said, perfect. And of course, he added, I told Chloe she had to be there. She's practically my sister. The words dripped with an irony so thick it was almost suffocating. My plan began to crystallize. It wouldn't be a screaming match. It would be a presentation, a quality audit report delivered calmly and factually. My greatest weapon wouldn't be anger, it would be evidence. I spent the next week in careful preparation. I created a small, elegant portfolio. Inside, I arranged the evidence in chronological order, printed on high-quality paper. Each page was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. A screenshot of the screwed-on-tight text conversation. A copy of the Chicago hotel restaurant bill for 2. A printout of Chloe's Instagram post from that same night. Page after page of undeniable proof. I also made a few calls. I contacted a highly rated divorce attorney for a consultation, just to understand my rights regarding the apartment and our shared assets. Knowledge was power. Then, I quietly began packing my personal belongings into boxes, storing them in the back of my closet, hidden under old blankets. I was systematically dismantling my life with him while he was busy planning the party that would celebrate it. The evening before the dinner, Sarah came over while Mark was at a late meeting. A meeting I now knew was dinner with Chloe. She helped me pack the last of my essential items. Are you sure you can go through with this? She asked, her eyes full of concern as she folded one of my sweaters. In front of all those people, his parents, I looked at the neat stack of boxes, the evidence portfolio lying on my desk. I thought about the humiliation I felt at that party, the years of quiet condescension, the breathtaking betrayal I read on his phone screen. My work taught me that ignoring a flaw doesn't make it go away. It only guarantees a bigger, more catastrophic failure down the line. This wasn't just revenge. It was a necessary, critical safety procedure. My job is to identify defects to prevent disaster. I told her, my voice steady and clear, Mark is a walking disaster, and tomorrow night I'm decommissioning him. The Sterling Club was even more opulent and intimidating than I had imagined. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings of Stern, faced founders, and the low, deferential murmur of uniformed staff. Mark's world. As we walked in, his hand was once again on my back, but this time I didn't feel like a prop. I felt like a Trojan horse. My clutch bag, containing the sleek portfolio of evidence, felt heavy with purpose. Mark's parents, Richard and Eleanor, greeted us with air kisses. They were polite but distant, a perfect reflection of their son's values. They saw me as a suitable, if uninspired, addition to the family portfolio. We were soon joined by Mark's boss, a senior partner named Mr. Harrison, and his wife, and then Chloe arrived. She wore a silver dress that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, looking every bit the victor. She hugged Mark, a little too long, a little too intimately, and then turned to me. Diane, she said, her voice like honey laced with arsenic. You look lovely. I'm so thrilled for you both. I met her gaze and gave her a smile that I hoped conveyed nothing but bland pleasantness. Let them think I was still the fool. Dinner was an agonizingly perfect affair. The conversation flowed around topics of finance, law, and the summer yachting season. I played my part, smiling demurely, laughing at the appropriate times, and letting Mark speak for me. I could feel him preening, soaking in the approval of his peers and family. He was the successful son, the rising star, with his pretty, quiet fiancé by his side. Finally, after the main course plates were cleared, Richard stood up, tapping his glass with a spoon. The room fell silent. Eleanor and I would just like to say a few words. He began, launching into a polished speech about Mark's ambition and how proud they were of the man he'd become. He ended by raising his glass. To Mark and Diane, may their future be as bright and successful as this evening. A chorus of "To Mark and Diane" echoed through the room. As everyone took a sip of their champagne, Mark leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Your turn, babe," he whispered. "Just say something sweet and thank everyone for coming." This was my cue. I stood up, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum. I smoothed down my dress, took a sip of water, and smiled at the expectant faces around the table. "Thank you, Richard, Eleanor," I began, my voice clear and calm, "and thank you all for coming to celebrate our engagement. It means the world to us." I paused, letting my eyes drift over the crowd before they settled on Mark. "Mark is right. This evening is about our future, and in my line of work, before you certify anything for the future, you must conduct a thorough inspection of the present. You have to ensure all components meet the required standards." A few confused looks were exchanged around the table. Mark's smile tightened at the corners. "Over the past few weeks," I continued, reaching into my clutch and pulling out the portfolio, "I've been conducting such an inspection on this relationship, and I'm afraid I found several critical systemic failures." I opened the portfolio. The silence in the room was now absolute, thick with tension. "Component 1, loyalty," I said, my voice as even as if I were delivering a quarterly report. "This component has been compromised. For example," I held up the first page, a clear printout of the texts between Mark and Chloe from the night of the party. I read them aloud. "Mark, she needs to understand her place. Chloe, did she say anything on the way home? Mark, nah, pouting, probably. She'll get over it. She always does." Chloe's face went white. Mark looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. His father, Richard, stared at him, his expression hardening. "Component 2, honesty." I went on, flipping the page. "This has suffered a catastrophic failure. I have here a credit card statement from Mark's solo business trip to Chicago last July, showing charges for a dinner for two at Alinea, a couple's spa package, and theater tickets." I then held up the next page. In a corresponding photo from Chloe's Instagram, posted that same night, captioned "Windy City Nights with the Best Company." The metadata on the photo, by the way, places it just 2 blocks from Mark's hotel. I continued, page by page, laying out the evidence from San Diego and Miami. Each piece of paper was a death blow. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply presented the data, my tone cool and professional. The portfolio was undeniable. When I was finished, I closed the portfolio and placed it gently on the table in front of Mark's father. "The conclusion of my inspection is that this partnership is defective beyond repair," I stated, looking directly at Mark. His face was a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. "It fails to meet even the most basic standards of trust, respect, and integrity. Therefore, I am officially recalling my engagement." I reached up, unclasped the diamond necklace he'd given me for my birthday, and placed it on top of the portfolio. Then, I slid the engagement ring from my finger and set it carefully beside the necklace. "This product," I said, my gaze sweeping from Mark to Chloe, then to his stunned parents, "does not pass inspection." With that, I turned, and without another word, I walked out of the silent dining room, leaving the wreckage of Mark's perfectly curated life scattered on the table behind me. Walking out of the Sterling Club felt like breaking the surface of the water after being held under for too long. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe. I didn't look back. Sarah was waiting for me in her car at the corner, just as we'd planned. The moment I slid into the passenger seat, the adrenaline that had been fueling me began to fade, and a deep, shuddering tremor went through my body. "It's over," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Sarah didn't say anything. She just reached over, squeezed my hand, and started driving towards my new, temporary home, her spare bedroom. The next 24 hours were a blur of blocked numbers and deleted accounts. Mark, as expected, unleashed a barrage of furious texts and voicemails. They cycled through disbelief, rage, threats, and finally, pathetic pleas for me to be reasonable and talk this out. Each message only validated my decision. I blocked his number, his parents' numbers, and deactivated all my social media. I was erecting a firewall around my life. The real fallout came through the grapevine. Sarah had a friend whose cousin worked at Mark's firm. The story spread like wildfire. According to the rumors, after my departure, Richard, Mark's father, had quietly read through the entire portfolio at the dinner table. He then stood up, looked at his son with utter contempt, and said, "You are a disgrace to this family." Before he and Eleanor walked out, Mark's boss, Mr. Harrison, followed soon after, shaking his head. Mark was left sitting at the table with Chloe, surrounded by the ruins of the evening. The professional consequences for Mark were swift. The stunt he pulled in front of a senior partner and major clients was a catastrophic lapse in judgment. He was seen as unstable and untrustworthy. Within a week, he was encouraged to pursue other opportunities. Chloe, too, faced repercussions at her own law firm, where the story of her role in the affair damaged her reputation among her colleagues. They had built their careers on an image of ruthless professionalism, and I had exposed them as nothing more than cheap, petty cheats. My own path was quieter. I used the attorney I had consulted to handle the legal separation of our assets. Because of the evidence I had compiled, the process was quick and heavily in my favor. Mark, desperate to avoid a public court battle that would air even more of his dirty laundry, agreed to buy me out of my share of the apartment's equity immediately. With the money, I found a small, bright apartment in a new part of the city, a place that had no memories of him. For the first time, I decorated it exactly as I wanted. It was filled with comfortable furniture, shelves overflowing with my books, and warm, inviting colors. It was a home, not a showroom. I threw myself back into my work, but with a new perspective. The job he had mocked, the skills he had belittled, were the very things that had saved me. My meticulous nature, my eye for detail, my refusal to accept a flawed product. These weren't just professional traits. They were the core of my strength. I had inspected the most important component of my life, found it to be defective, and had the courage to scrap it and start over. Months later, Sarah and I were having dinner at my new place. I was telling her about a major project I was leading at work, a new engine component that required a complete overhaul of our testing protocols. I was animated, passionate, and happy. "You seem different," Sarah said, smiling. "Not just happier, stronger. I thought about it for a moment. I am," I said. "For a long time, I let someone else define my worth. He saw my job as a punchline, and I let him, but I was wrong. My work isn't about checking if things are screwed on tight. It's about accountability. It's about upholding a standard, and I finally realized I deserved to apply that same standard to my own life. My future was no longer a pre-approved blueprint designed by someone else. It was a blank sheet, and I was the one holding the pen. I was in control of the quality of my own life, and the forecast was clear. There were no defects in sight. My life had been recalibrated, and all systems were finally go.